The second half of the 20th century was an eventful time. We had 2 world wars in the first half of the century. So, we're kind of hoping that the second half would be better. This is not necessarily the case. There were some really bad things that happened in the latter half of the 20th century, and there were also some great things. What were some of the most important events of the latter half of the 20th century? Let's find out. As we begin, let me remind you that this is my channel. If you want more world history, check out my channel. Okay, let's get started. All right, let's start with the end of the 1940s and go through the decades. The year is 1945. World War II has just ended. Now, the big power that helped win the war was the United States and the Soviet Union, but these two are not exactly friends. They're now part of what historians call the Cold War. It is called the Cold War because these two superpowers never directly fight each other. But they do everything they can to get an advantage over one another. The world is divided into 2 blocks. The United States leads the capitalist democratic bloc, and the Soviet Union leads the communist authoritarian bloc. These two compete with one another throughout the second half of the 20th century. You might think this competition isn't very healthy, and you're right, but it did produce some results. Competition between the two forced them to try and beat one another in all sorts of things, including technology. This competition is called the space race. We'll talk more about that later. So for now, let's get back to the 1950s. In 1950, there is a war in Korea. The Korean peninsula at this point is divided into 2. There is North Korea and South Korea. North Korea was backed by China and the Soviet Union. South Korea was backed by the United States and the United Nations. North Korea invades South Korea, but eventually the North Koreans are pushed back. The war ends in 1953, and nothing really changes. Korea is still divided today. Another big story in the 1950s was decolonization. Most of the Asian and African nations were still colonies of European powers in 1945. By 1960, most of them were independent. For example, India became independent in 1947, and Ghana became independent in 1957. In the 1950s, technology starts to change life. For example, television becomes popular in the 1950s, and the first computers are being developed. And if you liked school dances, then you probably liked rock and roll music. In the 1950s, Elvis Presley made rock and roll music popular. Let's jump ahead to the 1960s. In the early 1960s, the world comes close to nuclear war. This is called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union puts missiles in Cuba, which is close to the United States. The U.S. is worried because these missiles could reach the United States. Premier Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union and President John F. Kennedy of the United States negotiate, and eventually, Khrushchev agrees to remove the missiles. In the 1960s, the United States goes to war in Vietnam. The Soviets and the Chinese are supporting the communist government of North Vietnam. The U.S. does not want to see communism spread to South Vietnam, so they intervene. This war lasts until 1975, and many Americans die. Eventually, the U.S. withdraws from the war, and the North Vietnamese conquer the South, and Vietnam becomes a communist nation. In the 1960s, there is a movement for civil rights in the United States. The African Americans want to be treated equally to white Americans. Key leaders include Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. The civil rights activists face much violence, but eventually they achieve their goal. In 1964, the U.S. passes the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination based on race or color. Back to the space race. Remember how I told you about the competition between the U.S. and the USSR? Well, in 1957, the USSR launches the first satellite into space. It was called Sputnik. 4 years later, a Soviet cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, becomes the first person to go into space. That same year, President John F. Kennedy of the U.S. pledged to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. On July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become the first humans to walk on the moon. That's pretty cool. The 1960s was also a time of counterculture. What is counterculture? It's when young people develop their own culture, values, and behaviors that are different from the rest of society. This often leads to protests and other forms of dissent. For example, the hippies were a counterculture movement in the 1960s. Now let's move on to the 1970s. In the 1970s, there is a period of between the United States and the Soviet Union. This means there is a temporary easing of cold. War tensions. Both sides signed several arms control treaties. In 1973, the U.S. and North Vietnam sign a peace agreement, and the U.S. withdraws from Vietnam. 2 years later, in 1975, Saigon falls and Vietnam is unified under a communist government. There are 2 Arab-Israeli wars in the 1960s. There is another one in the 1970s. This is called the Yom Kippur War. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria attack Israel. Israel wins the war, but now they occupy even more land than before. In 1973, there is an oil crisis. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, places an embargo on nations that support Israel. This causes oil prices to rise and causes recessions in many countries. In the 1970s, many military dictatorships came to power in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Also, there are several revolutions in this period. For example, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution overthrows the pro-Western government of Iran and replaces it with a fundamentalist Islamic State. Now let's get into the 1980s. The U.S. President Ronald Reagan takes a hard stance against the Soviet Union. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. Many people believe that Reagan's policies helped bring about the end of the Cold War. In 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and the war drags on. The U.S. supports the Afghan fighters called the Mujahideen. The Soviet war in Afghanistan is one reason why the Soviet economy weakens and eventually collapses. In the 1980s, several military dictatorships fell. For example, in 1979, the Philippines dictator Ferdinand Marcos was ousted. Also, in 1980, after 36 years in power, the Shah of Iran is overthrown. At the end of the 1980s, communism falls in Eastern Europe. Several revolutions occur. In Poland in 1980, East Germany in 1989, Hungary in 1989, Czechoslovakia in 1989, and Romania in 1989, the people overthrow their communist governments. In 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961 to stop people from escaping from East Germany to West Germany. Its purpose was to symbolize the division of Europe into the Western democratic nations and the Eastern authoritarian communist nations. Its dismantling symbolizes the end of the Cold War. In 1989, there is a revolution in China. Students protest in Tiananmen Square, but the government cracks down on the protesters. In the 1980s and 1990s, personal computers become commonplace in homes and offices. In the late 20th century, there is a growth of the women's rights movement. This is called feminism. Finally, we have the 1990s. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolves and becomes several different republics. In 1991, there is a coup in the Soviet Union. Hardline communists attempt to remove Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev from power. However, the coup fails, and the Soviet Union continues to disintegrate. In 1991, there is a major ecological disaster in Russia. A nuclear reactor at the Chernobyl plant explodes, causing the worst nuclear accident in history. Thanks for watching. What was your favorite decade of the second half of the 20th century? Let me know in the comments section. I'm the host. This has been my channel. And if you want more world history, check out my channel.